So the evidence we have collected so far seems to point into the direction that purchasing power parity theory doesn't seem to be extremely strong because exchange rate on the market seems to be too volatile um, compared to how much the consumer price indexes and in general price levels move over time. This doesn't mean that PPP theory is completely useless. One area of economic research in which PPP theory is used is to construct values for gross domestic product across countries. Why? Well, suppose that we want to compare GDP in the United States with GDP in another country which uses a different currency. Think about, in our example, in slide 23, India, which uses rupees. One thing, so we would like to compare these two numbers. We would like to get a sense of how much, how different, how larger is GDP in the United States compared to GDP in India, for example. There's a problem with that. We would be tempted to make them comparable to transform GDP in India into the same units of GDP in the United States, which would be dollars. How can we do that? Well, one thing that we could do is just to use the market exchange rate, and which would tell us how many dollars we needed to make one Indian rupee, one Indian unit of currency, and we could just simply multiply the number of the value of the GDP in India in local currency by the exchange rate and obtain a conversion in dollars. The problem is that the exchange rate is going to reflect transaction for goods that are traded. As we know, the demand and the supply for foreign currency comes for either transactions in goods, import and exports, or services, or for financial transactions to buy financial security, bonds, stocks, and so on and so forth. The problem is that an economy, gross domestic product, is not just composed by tradable goods, which is what we have just described, but it's also in large part composed of non-tradable goods. Think about haircuts, think about restaurants and meals, and so on and so forth. It tends to be true that in developing economies like India, and you can think of China, you can think of African countries, you can think of Eastern European countries or Latin American countries, and so on and so forth. These non-tradable goods tend to constitute a large fraction of gross domestic product, a larger fraction than the fraction of non-tradable goods in developed countries like Canada or the United States. The problem is that by using an exchange rate that is based on transactions for tradable goods, we are underestimating the value of GDP in developing countries where most of the economy is based on non-tradables. Here is where PPP theory comes to help us. Instead of using a market exchange rate, we use an exchange rate which would make the price of these goods identical between the United States and India. Think about a meal, think about a pizza. A pizza is should be worth the same amount of dollars whether we are in India or whether we are in the US. If we convert GDP of India using market exchange rates, we might be underestimating the fact that in India, a lot of pizza or a lot of rice balls are produced compared to the United States. By using an exchange rate that equalizes the price of these two identical goods in the United States and in India. We are correcting for the bias that is implicit in using market exchange rates. These are large, when we use PPP based exchange rates, GDP of India gets boosted quite a bit. And so, using PPP exchange rates offers us a more realistic measure of the level of production in developing countries. So that's an area in which PPP theory is used, and I'm reporting one example of this. You will see if you go on databases such as the World Bank or the IMF, that measures for GDP are offered both in current dollars and in real or PPP based dollars, and those are probably the measures that are appropriate if we're trying to measure GDP for developing countries.